here at Welch, who is part of Banlieue network from the first hour, we could say. So he worked with us since September 2012, and he was one of the pillars or most important members of the summer school that we met in Paris. So people who were there already. When we started working together, Ed was part of University of Durham, but he recently joined the University of Aberdeen in September 2013 as a Carnegie Professor of French after 12 years at Durham University. His research explores the cultural history of post-war France and it lives through modernization and decolonization. His first book examines the emergence of the French writer François Mauriac, and he worked with Dr. Joe McConaughey at the University of Manchester, completed an interesting funded project in 2011 on the representation of the Franco-Algerian relationship from the time of French Algeria to the present day. The book emerging from this research contesting views, the visual economy of France and Algeria, was published by Liverpool University Press in May 2013. His current work pursues a long-standing interest in spatial planning, urban space and modernization in post-war France. It focuses especially on the state-led planning and modernization of the tourist and post-tourist areas and the ways in which space was produced and configured as a result. And today he's going to speak about the Passagers du Roissy-Express.
Thank you, Christina. Thank you to Juliet, who's headed off for the moment. Thank you for inviting me to participate in the conference and to open it, which is always an honour and a privilege. And also thank you for all the effort that you put into organising and running the Banlieue network over the past couple of years. Which is manifesting itself today not only in this conference but also in the exhibition that I'm certainly very much looking forward to seeing this evening, and which will explore and kind of show off some of the work that was produced during the summer school last July in Saint-Denis, which was a very kind of exciting event, partly because of its combination of discussion and exploration and kind of situated thinking about the Banlieue. And I really wanted to take the opportunity in the course of this morning's talk just to kind of think about some of the questions that we're being asked to address and engage with as part of the Banlieue project, but also of the conference. And I think perhaps the most fundamental and essential of these is the need to recognise the heterogeneity and also the complexity of the Banlieue as a multiplicity of places and spaces which fall under this label. And there's a curious mark of thinking about space within France, I would suggest, which is the degree to which the Banlieue of Paris or any other large city, and although we're focusing on Paris, I think a lot of what we're going to be thinking about is really addressing all those kind of complex spaces on the peripheries of large urban centres, particularly in France, but also elsewhere, of course. And it's this curious degree to which the Banlieue is homogenised within discourse, that's to say within the way in which we talk about the Banlieue. And it's not just that the term has become a shorthand for all the problems of social exclusion, ghettoisation and marginality. It was very interesting that your Pro Vice-Chancellor was aware of the Banlieue precisely in that context as a very kind of negative space. So all these problems which characterise the lives of millions of French citizens living on the periphery of its largest cities. It's a word whose connotations bring to mind a series of predominantly negative associations, linked especially to social unrest, violence, delinquency, police repression. Yet even before the word became so radically politicised in the 1980s and the 1990s, as France struggled to come to terms with le problème des banlieues, the places it designated were assumed to be subordinate to the city around which they developed, mere, you might say, adjuncts to the more vital activity of the centre, as the place where la vraie vie was to be found. And go into any bookshop today in Paris or France for that matter, and you will find maps and atlases of Paris et sa banlieue. And the possessive pronoun articulates both the relationship of hierarchy and dependency between centre and periphery, and also the reduction of a large and diverse collection of places, each with its own history, to an undifferentiated and amorphous urban space. At the same time, the project and the conference are inviting us to think about how the banlieue, and here I'm using the term the plural with an S on the end in a kind of Derridian moment. Of course, you can't sort of spot the plural necessarily, but I think it's important to pluralise the banlieue for the very reasons that I've been talking about. So the project and the conference are inviting us to think about how the banlieue are and can be mediated, portrayed, represented, articulated, or otherwise transformed or turned into symbolic form, and also what's at stake in that process. On the one hand, therefore, we need to challenge dominant representations, or to use the word of the conference, clichés of the banlieue, representations which often precisely assert them as undifferentiated spaces of trouble, delinquency and danger. On the other, we need to investigate different modes of exploring and understanding the banlieue in order to tell different stories about them, to bring other voices to the fore, and to illuminate new understandings and perceptions through image, text, voice and sound. Finally, we also need to get to grips with the peculiarities and the complexities of space in the banlieue. That's to say, the distinctive qualities and forms suburban spaces acquire when they become layered with history, reconfigured, and subject to different uses. In other words, the conference is an invitation to think about the variety of ways in which we need to get to grips with the banlieue, or to draw on a term from my title, to apprehend the banlieue. So why this term apprehending? Well, I was kind of drawn to it because of what's implied by it. Apprehending has this kind of idea of capturing or cornering something that is elusive or that is evasive, that's difficult to pin down. Apprehension usually implies an approach which is indirect or oblique, which mobilises a range of perspectives in a form of triangulation through which space can be mapped, read and made visible. Of course, it also has an implication of judicial process or criminal investigation, a relationship which has informed much political discourse in relation to the banlieue over the past 20 or 30 years. This isn't the sort of relationship which is in play in the project's work on the banlieue, on the contrary, but the notion of apprehension is useful for highlighting the desire of the project both to illuminate and to understand the banlieue, as well as to reconfigure our thinking about it. And doing so involves a response which is creative or lateral in its attempts to come at its object, but which must also recognise the possibility that its object may slip through its fingers, or give it the slip. And the need not just to recognise this, but also to celebrate it is something that I'll return to at the end of my talk. At the same time, I use the term desire here consciously to reflect and articulate the fundamental fascination with the banlieue, and the Parisian banlieue especially, which not only drives this project, but which has been a motive force in French culture and French cultural studies over several decades. Indeed, this fascination can trace its origins at least as far back as Baudelaire's poetic exploration of the city's margins in the 19th century, and has its genealogy in work by figures such as Auger, Benjamin, and the Surrealists, as well as the street photographers of post-war France. And this raises a series of questions. Where does the fascination for the banlieue lie? Why is engagement with it such an urgent business? What keys to the city, or what insights, does it afford? And what are we looking for in apprehending the banlieue? What's at stake in this act of spatial inquiry? I want to explore some of these questions by going via what we might term an project, to kind of draw on some Benjaminian vocabulary, on the banlieue, an antecedent which has since acquired legendary status in the realm of French studies. And I'm referring to the journey undertaken by François Maspereau and Anaïque France along the RER line B during the spring of 1989, the account of which was published in 1990 as Les Passagers du Roissy-Express. If I want to return us to this text, it's because of its continued relevance for thinking about the Banlieue as a location of what Maspero himself termed la vraie vie, about the nature and consequences of spatial production in the Banlieue, and about the methods and politics of spatial enquiry. That's to say, about the ways in which we can get to grips with the spaces of the Banlieue, and about what might be at stake as we do so. So I thought I'd begin with a brief recap of the journey. I decided we could give this paper, but I'd dispense with a PowerPoint. It's actually quite liberating to dispense with PowerPoint, but you'll have to kind of do a little bit of work of visual imagination, perhaps unaided, unsupported by the PowerPoint slides. So I want to begin with a brief recap of the journey. Maspero and France take a month to travel the length of the line from its northern terminus at Roissy Airport to its southern extremity at Saint-Rémy-les-Chevreuses. They stop off at each station along the way, 38 in total, in order to visit the surrounding area, with the notable exception of those in central Paris. The time and the effort they take to explore and describe the northern suburbs contrasts sharply with the sense of fatigue and irritation which pervades the second half of the journey into the more comfortable lands of the southern banlieue, dominated by zone pavillonnaire. Now the interest, well, there are many interests of Les Passagers, but one of the ones that I want to foreground in particular is its sustained attempt to counteract the myths and perceptions of the banlieue which were well entrenched by the late 1980s. In terms of the banlieue, firstly as the locus of social, political and spatial crisis in France, and secondly, when not a source of threat and violence, as a space which appears to dwellers of the city centre as a blank space, or, to quote Maspero, un magma informe, un désert de 10 millions d'habitants, une suite de constructions grises indifferenciées. An undifferentiated space in sharp contrast to the richness, fullness and high definition of the capital city. The text reasserts the spatial complexity of the suburbs by foregrounding the history and diversity of the places they visit and uncovering the heterogeneity which proliferates beneath apparently interchangeable or endlessly reproducible urban landscapes. Indeed, Maspero's provocation is that it's in the banlieue rather than the city centre where la vraie vie is to be found. So this term la vraie vie, I think we can understand as real life or authentic life, which he opposes to the increasingly reified nature of life in central Paris, a sense of space being frozen in time or transformed into spectacle for a tourist gaze. We think it interesting to reflect on what la vraie vie means, and of course there's a sort of echo here, I guess, of the work of maybe Élise Etcherelli, Élise de la vraie vie, Claire Etcherelli, Élise de la vraie vie, and what might lurk beneath this term, la vraie vie. The stasis or fixity of the city centre contrasts with the spatial instability and proliferation of built space in the suburbs, where we have a sense of space travelling through time and accruing palimpsestual layers of history as a result. This spatial proliferation signals growth and development, but also lends the traveller's journey an archaeological quality. The Passagers du Roissy-Express is a journey through the history of spatial development and production in the Paris region, and through the forms spatial development takes. As such, it encourages to think about how those different spaces are practiced, how they shape the lives of the people who find themselves there, and how the modalities and techniques of spatial inquiry can draw such questions to the surface. Two key insights emerge from the traveller's investigation of space in the Paris region, both of which are pertinent for the work of the Banlieue project. Firstly, the text serves, or the journey and the text both serve as a reminder of the broadly concentric nature of spatial development in and around Paris. Their journey towards the city centre from Roissy-Charles de Gaulle via Villepinte, and Aulnay-sous-Bois to La Courneuve and Aubervilliers is a journey back in time. That is to say, from new space produced in the 1960s and 1970s to the much older urban development associated with 19th and 20th century industrialisation. More precisely, to move towards the centre of Paris is to enter increasingly complex zones of spatial layering and juxtaposition. As successive bursts of urbanisation and spatial production overlay, override, or abut each other in the landscape. And this process of spatial production leads to the coexistence and collision of different conceptions of space and spatial organisation, and spaces with radically different look and feel, which produce different affective responses in the people who inhabit and practice them. For example, perhaps the most telling example, and here I looked at Bruno Levasseur, who would be the audience. It's when they spend time around La Courneuve and Aubervilliers. And there's quite an extended discussion of the time they spend in Aubert and La Courneuve. Partly because there's a sense in which Aubervilliers is this very traditional working class suburb of northern Paris somehow speaks to François Maspero as this. François Maspero, for those of you who don't know very much about Maspero, he was a left-wing radical, particularly known as a radical publisher in the 1960s and the 1970s. His publishing house was famous for publishing some of the radical Marxist and left-wing writing of that period, such as the work of Frantz Fanon. And he was very much part of the radical intelligentsia, I think it's fair to say, of post-war France, and friends with Chris Macker and that group of people in French politics. And so there's a sense in which returning to Aubervilliers is this site of authentic working class identity is reflected in the amount of time that he spends in Aubervilliers. But of course, one of the important and interesting things about Aubervilliers is the way in which it lies next to La Courneuve. La Courneuve, one of the most important products of post-war spatial planning in the 1960s. The other, Aubervilliers, a working class town which grew during France's industrial period. And Maspero has a nice phrase, sort of quite elliptical phrase to describe the two. Aubervilliers, vieille ville, prolétaire. La Courneuve, jeune monstre, grandit trop vite. And of course, mobilising the term monstre, that already kind of brings with it a certain freight of understanding and perception of this environment. And I think what's particularly rich in this encounter of Aubervilliers and with and of Aubervilliers and La Courneuve is the importance and the sensitivity to boundaries and frontiers which are lived and internalised by local residents as well as by the visitors. So, for example, here is Maspero recounting the journey towards La Courneuve on foot. En route, he says, en route pour les 4000 de La Courneuve, une avenue à traverser et adieu Aubervilliers. So this sense of how boundaries are laid into the landscape, in this instance, une avenue, which we can imagine is quite a broad road, obviously quite in its way quite an imposing physical frontier, spatial and physical frontier between these two spaces, and a clear demarcatory line between these two spaces. Passing over the threshold, and here again, it's useful to draw on the work of somebody like Benjamin to think of thresholds and boundaries and frontiers. Passing over that threshold enacts some sort of mental and affective and emotional responses, as well as a simple physical displacement from one side of the road to the other. Hakim, who is a young animateur working in La Courneuve, but a native of Aubervilliers, also kind of enacts or articulates this sense of spatial belonging and spatial dislocation. He says, "Dès que je vois le panneau qui annonce Aubert, je me sens mieux." Notice that kind of emotional, affective vocabulary. Je suis chez moi. So here I think we can begin to find some examples or some indications for the idea or the approach of spatial inquiry that we might want to pursue. Spatial inquiry can be seen as about tracing and identifying the organisation of the built environment, how spaces change, and also the nature of transition from one location to another, this idea of the threshold or the boundary or the frontier or the zone of transition. It's also about the perceptions of those transitions, how identity is constituted in spatial terms, that is to say through identification with a specific locale and through the articulation of often precise boundaries, landmarks and frontiers. And the exploration of the physical and imagined geography, and the two go together, of Aubervilliers and La Courneuve, highlights the second key dimension of Les Passagers. The first part of the book, especially, in its account of the northern section of the RARB, can be read as an investigation and evocation of the nature of planned space, and specifically the spaces produced through the implementation of the Schéma Directeur d'Aménagement et d'Urbanisme de la Région de Paris. Sorry, that's a bit technical title for this planning operation that took place during the 1960s. I'll henceforth call it the Schéma Directeur. The French do like acronyms, but the Schéma Directeur does not give a good acronym. It produces the word SDRAL, which is particularly conducive to discussion. So, one of the things that I think Les Passagers is very good at, and actually one of the things that doesn't always get picked out in critical discussion of the work, is the way in which it is an exploration of this specifically, quite specific planned space of this post-war period that emerges out of the Schéma Directeur. And the Schéma Directeur, for those of you who might not know, was an elaborate plan for urban development and modernisation encompassing both the city and an area around it of some 80 square kilometres. It was drawn up by Paul de Louvrier at the behest of Charles de Gaulle in 1961 and published in 1965. And the Schéma Directeur is actually a map, that's its physical form. It's a 1 to 100,000 scale map of Paris and the Paris region with an accompanying commentary. I've probably not really got much time to tell you about Paul de Louvrier, but he's a very interesting character insofar as he was a kind of classic Gaullist fonctionnaire, very kind of high-ranking civil servant. But particularly interesting because of the fact that he'd also served time in Algeria. He was one of the last governor, délégué général in Algeria in the run-up to independence. And as a figure who can circulate between these two spheres of activity, both modernisation within metropolitan France, within the hexagon, but also as part of the kind of final stages of France's colonial apparatus in Algeria. He kind of articulates some of those quite complex shifts and changes that are affecting French politics, but also French society and French culture in that post-war period, in particular the period of decolonisation. And this is where, to go back to my interest, this is where decolonisation and modernisation converge in very interesting ways. And de Louvrier is one of those figures, one of those actors who embody those kind of tensions or kind of processes at work in French society at the time. So de Louvrier was commanded, and the word I think is the key, the word is emphasised here, was commanded by Charles de Gaulle to produce this Schéma Directeur. And here's François Maspereau, again a very kind of pithy account of this process of spatial planning in the post-war period. Cela se passait en 1960. De Louvrier avait dit de Gaulle, la région parisienne c'est le bordel. Il y a ces banlieues inhumaines, mettez-moi de l'ordre là-dedans. Of course, the great Gaullist word. De Louvrier avait répondu quelque chose dans le genre de affirmatif mon général. Et il avait mis de l'ordre. And there we have, in the space of a couple of sentences, quite the history, or the kind of quite a large and expansive and important and significant process of spatial reconfiguration that's kind of unleashed on the Banlieue, and will actually play itself out over the course of some 20 or 30 years, and arguably it still goes on today. A key part of the plan was the building of 8 new satellite towns in a ring around Paris, 5 of which would actually be built, including Cergy-Pontoise, Évry and Banlieue. The scheme also included the new international airport at Roissy, the RER network, which connected the new towns to Paris via the nodal point of Châtelet-Léal, and also large-scale housing projects such as les 4000 de la Courneuve. And also, of course, we need to pay attention to the tone of Maspero's comments here. Really, that's a subject for another discussion, I think. But there's no doubt in which Maspero fingers the schéma directeur as in large part responsible for France's post-war spatial crisis. So the first part of the book especially is an extensive encounter, and a hugely critical encounter, with the spaces of the schéma directeur, starting with Roissy-Charles de Gaulle itself, and their transit through Roissy, although of course they don't use the space properly the way it's meant to be used, because they don't actually get an airplane, they kind of leave the terminal and head back towards the village de Roissy. So their journey through Roissy itself is dominated by a sense of spatial disorientation, discontinuity and alienation. Moreover, both the journey and the text themselves are structured by the framework provided by the RERB, which was a vital part of the infrastructure created by the schéma directeur. The text is as much a product of post-war spatial planning as the places visited by the travellers. But at the same time, of course, the text also offers its own gesture of resistance to, or détournement of, planned space and infrastructure. In getting off the train at each stop to explore the surrounding area, that's to say, by acting not as commuters, but as tourists, they refuse to use the RER for its intended purpose, as a means to ensure the rapid and efficient circulation of the large workforce around the metropolitan area. And it's here in the modes and techniques of spatial enquiry which underpin Les Passagers that we can find the particular richness of the text and the ways in which it begins to capture and articulate the nature of la vraie vie. Above all, I would argue its insights are grounded in the phenomenologically and haptically based description of encounters with spaces and people and of the practice of space. Description is predicated especially on walking, on foot-bound articulation of space, and careful attention to moments and zones of transition, the location of individuals in the landscape, and the ways in which spatial organisation can dictate movement, but also the ways in which spatial organisation can be resisted and challenged thanks to the relative freedom offered by walking. As such, it's a way of investigating and writing about space, which extends Michel de Certeau's theorisation of walking as ruse and trick. Although, I would argue that there's, well, I mean, that we could talk a little bit about Certeau's notion of the ruse and a reappropriation of space in L'Invention du Quotidien. And what's interesting in that book, de Certeau's book, is that the way he's writing, it emerges quite clearly that he's writing specifically about planned space. So in a way, Les Passagers du Roissy-Express and L'Invention du Quotidien, both of these kind of quite seminal texts of the 1980s about space in France, are both addressing and responding to the particularities of what de Certeau would call technocratic space in post-war France. So we can read Les Passagers both as a field guide to the northern suburbs of Paris, but also as a handbook of spatial enquiry, a reminder of the techniques and methods with which we can begin to get to grips with built space, plot its complexities, identify its boundaries and its zones of transition. It's in this way especially that it chimes with the aims and the focus of the Banlieue project and the work of this conference over the next 2 days. Last July's summer school in and around Saint-Denis was grounded in the particularities of the urban environment between the ancient royal city of Saint-Denis and France's capital city. I was very kind of drawn to the sustained work of capturing and articulating the nature of the spaces there. I'll talk about 2 in particular that you'll see this afternoon or this evening in the exhibition. The first of these are some of the images by our friend and colleague John Perry-Valaris, and his engagement with bridges and with concrete. And in taking these photos of the spaces between Saint-Denis and Paris, in the Plaine Saint-Denis, particularly to the north of the Stade de France, part of that very complex environment. It's a fascinating environment because of the way in which it brings together, it juxtaposes all forms of all sorts of different sorts of spaces and environments. You've got the motorway, you've got the rail lines, you've got pedestrian walkways, you've got the canal, you've got all these kinds of different forms, different kind of modes of transport and forms of circulation in the landscape, all being kind of brought together in a way that renders the exploration of those spaces quite complex, and which is actually quite a challenging environment for a pedestrian to be in. And thinking about the practice of those spaces became a very important part of the work that we were doing. And these environments, you'll see them in the photos this evening, they're environments which to a degree confirm our expectations of space in the Banlieue, particularly from the point of view of pedestrians who are challenged, framed and buffeted by an infrastructure in which they have a subordinate role. But at the same time, what these images also do is to remind us of the perspectives and elevations which offer an exhilarating reminder of the openness and diversity of Banlieue landscapes, and also of the difficulty of doing justice to their diversity, history and complexity. Central to producing these perspectives was precisely walking, as a group but also individually. In particular, one of the things that emerged through conversation with Pere Valaris and Diane Regisford was the notion of slow walking, which is something that both John and Diane undertook along the Canal Saint-Denis. I couldn't join in for slow walking because I had to get a quicker train back to the Gare du Nord to get an even faster train back to the UK. But we quite enjoyed that kind of juxtaposition of, again, these different rhythms of transportation and modes of movement through the landscape. And again, this notion of slow walking is quite a stimulating one to work with, I think. There's something quite important about what we might see as a gesture of double deceleration. Why double deceleration? Well, already to walk is in some way arguably to challenge the increasingly frenetic rhythms of movement and transportation in the city and its suburbs, the sort of rhythms dictated by the regular passing of the RER train to the Plaine Saint-Denis. Now, we might be tempted to align slow walking with the practice of Benjamin's 19th century flaneur. If you're familiar with Benjamin's writing on Charles Baudelaire, there's a wonderful moment in which he's describing the arcades, and he's describing the flaneur in the arcades, and he makes the comment that whether this is apocryphal or whether it's rooted in any kind of historical fact, I don't know. But he imagines the flaneur taking a turtle for a walk in the arcades, and as he says, this famous phrase that resonates all the time, letting the turtle set the pace as a way of slowing down the rhythm of urban walking and presenting a kind of challenge to the increasingly frenetic pace of urban living. But I would argue that the flaneur's willful display of leisure as spectacle has motivations rather different from the careful observation and articulation of space that slow walking permits. It's an attention to the textures, sounds, rhythms, street furniture, shifts of light and faint frontiers which define one's perception of the urban environment and one's being in it. The effort to record the different textures of urban space, which is captured by much of the material on display in the exhibition accompanying the conference, I think is one of the things that emerges quite strongly from it, and something that I'd invite you to kind of think about as we review some of the work that's on display there. Two further things, and these are 2 points that with which I will conclude. And 2 further things emerge from the close attention to suburban space, both in the Passagers du Roissy-Express and the work of the Banlieue project. The first is the fundamental spatial instability of the Banlieue, the way in which they are susceptible to processes of urban change. Processes which produce the heterogeneous, layered and palimpsestual landscapes traversed by Maspero and captured by Pere Valaris amongst others. They exist as zones of transition and therefore as zones in constant transition themselves, subject to remodelling, reordering, and to coin a phrase in the time of Barry Houseman, of creative destruction. As Maspero notes in a postface to the Passagers du Roissy-Express written in 1994, no sooner had he and Anne passed through that Plaine Saint-Denis than it was being reconfigured and transformed by the construction of the Stade de France. The second point, the second thing that emerges, I think, the one I mentioned earlier, and the point with which I will conclude, is precisely the difficulty of apprehending the banlieue, of putting them into words or into pictures and sounds for that matter. They are spaces and places which often slip from one's grasp. And this is expressed in the rapidly growing gap between Maspero's notes and the progress of their journey. It's expressed in the increasingly lapidary way in which he narrates the later stages of the journey, and particularly of the refrain of "On les a vus," with which he closes the final chapter, and which depicts two weary and ghostly figures slipping across the landscapes of the southern banlieue. This difficulty is born of spatial complexity and instability, and also, moreover, always has the potential to edge us back towards cliché. And I think that's one of the interesting tensions, one of the interesting questions raised by this conference. It's precisely the degree to which cliché needs to be challenged, needs to be disrupted, but the ways in which we can do that without necessarily resorting to other cliché. And that difficult negotiation and dialogue between cliché and also with cliché. But it doesn't mean that we should stop trying. The trick is to find different ways to capture the banlieue, techniques through which we can glean insights into the nature of suburban spaces and the ways in which they shape suburban life and the everyday. Both terms, suburban life, everyday life, both terms synonymous arguably with la vraie vie. And it's at this point where we engage with the lived realities of everyday life, when spatial enquiry and the techniques used to pursue it place us firmly on the terrain of political in its fullest sense. That's to say, on the terrain of action, having a bearing on the polis, on the political and democratic community as it is constituted in and by the city. Thanks for your attention.
Je vais passer en français parce que, pour encourager les réactions dans les deux langues, pour faire un peu d'équilibre. Je remerciais d'ouvrir ce colloque par cette réflexion et relecture des Passagers du Roissy-Express et en fait d'avoir ouvert la voie à la réflexion sur l'espace de la banlieue, l'usage de cet espace, les usages planifiés et les usages imprévus qui vont à l'encontre des usages qui ont été proposés pour ces espaces. Et je crois qu'il y a beaucoup de notions clés qui ont émergé de la conférence qu'on va certainement utiliser beaucoup pendant ces 2 journées d'intervention, notamment la théorie de l'espace, la pratique de l'espace, l'exploration visuelle, l'exploration dans l'espace, la marche, le rythme de la marche rapide pour accélérer, les changements de l'espace urbain, la complexité de l'espace, le côté ou le caractère transformatif de l'espace périurbain et beaucoup d'autres. Donc j'invite la salle à commenter ou à poser des questions ou à réfléchir ensemble à ces premières pensées.
Well, thank you very much for this great revisiting of it's been a while since I read the text, and so it's wonderful to be reminded to get back and spend some time with it. But I was interested to hear. I've been beginning to think a little bit about the question of the mixed landscape and the question of the polemic around the Moche. And I was wondering if you mentioned now, obviously, as being privileged in the second part of Mescal and Alice's journey, but of course, this is even the northern suburbs are also a very mixed landscape. And speaking of the boundary between Aubervilliers and Banlieue, there's this very sort of complex, almost pavillionaire zone of houses along the Rue Crèvecoeur, which marks the boundary between Aubervilliers and Courbevoie in one part, which I always find this, speaking of this working class affectivity related to the town. I think that's kind of a funny little thing. But so I wanted to ask you, since you've been working closely on the Mescal, how you see that mixed landscape in the initial chapters, particularly, I think, and whether you think that Mescal's approach has anything at all to do with this polemic around La Moche, which I think opens some interesting avenues for thinking the way that the suburban landscape is produced by and for capital, but which also runs the risk of replacing one cliché with another.
Oh, good question. I think, yeah. Where should we start with that? Should we do Maspero in kind of working class space, maybe?
Sure.
Firstly, and then we can come on to the other. I mean, I think one of the richnesses of, or the pleasures of dealing with the Maspero text is the way in which it sets out to be kind of almost totalizing in its attempt to kind of map those kind of northern suburbs, and yet at the same time, despite the fact that he's kind of, they're claiming they're not pursuing a project, they're not pursuing a narrative, they're letting stories come to them. There is a sense in which he's on the lookout for something. There's a sense in which he is on the lookout for that kind of the authentic of the working class, particularly in the north. I think the text is good because of the fact that the heterogeneity that it talks about is precisely differences in built form, actually, which would include, I mean, they do draw attention to the fact that there are, for example, zones pavillonnaires, that there's mixed housing in terms of private and social housing. And actually, and I think they're quite sensitive to that. I think what they're also quite good at is highlighting the kind of the rural dimension, actually, of that northern Banlieue, and they spend quite a lot of time around the canal and the allotments and that kind of those pockets of non-urban space almost, or kind of wild space potentially. But I do get the sense that there's still this sort of way in which they're drawn to, they keep coming back, and it's that idea of keep coming back. They keep coming back to particular locations, and they are the working class locations. But you could argue that's partly as a result of those kind of dispositions that he has, if you want to kind of mobilise a bit of Paul Lear's vocabulary, the kind of dispositions that he has, the kind of sense of belonging that they display, and both of them talk about their kind of marginal self-identity. They perceive themselves as kind of slightly marginal figures in a way. I think France certainly does this in her role as a photographer. It must be a wall kind of, I think, is slightly more influence on it. So I think from that point, I think there's a very definite sense of the kind of the diversity, and I think the kind of the wild spaces and the natural spaces, in inverted commas, that they turn to is part of that. I think they draw attention to the kind of what you might call the middle class settlements around Aulnay-sous-Bois, for example. I think they're quite good at capturing Aulnay in that way. You've got the kind of the new estates, and you've got these nevertheless sort of more old-fashioned, traditional kind of provincial French areas. But there is a kind of, there's almost like a kind of, they're favouring particular spaces. And sometimes I wonder if that's partly as a result of the geography and partly a result of the RER line and where it goes, actually. And the degree to which maybe they're kind of responding to the sorts of locations they found themselves in as a result of getting off the station. But that's not really the answer to your question, it's more a kind of an elaboration of it. But I think you're right, there is that sense of spatial complexity, particularly in the north, but that's balanced with this attraction for, and I think there was a kind of response there, an attraction for seeking out those, you know, la banlieue rouge, in effect, that kind of authentic working class location. But yeah, no, I think certainly I concur with what you say, and you've reminded me of La Rue Crèvecoeur, which is just a fabulous name, isn't it, for a street? You know? In terms of La Banlieue moche, that's yeah. I mean, I think again that there's clearly an intervention in that debate in terms of how they write about the post-war built space. You know, and it's quite clear when they go to La Courneuve. But what's also good about that section, I think, is the ways in which they talk about the attempts to kind of redevelop La Banlieue, you know, Banlieue 89, the big kind of Castro project, and the blowing up of the bar in La Courneuve, Bar des Cagnes, and I think it's Debussy that gets blown up. And there's this whole, I mean, Bruno might have something to say about this, this whole reflection on the fact of eradicating that block, that tower block, in effect, although on the one, you know, clearly it's a good thing insofar as it was a critique of, you know, monstrous bits of building, arguably. On the other, what he also draws out is the way in which people have this sense of lack and loss as a result of losing those environments, which are domestic spaces, and which are memories, and which are all the rest of it. So again, I think there is Masspero would clearly align himself, I think, with a position that much of the political intervention in suburban space in France in the post-war period has produced a large number of very serious problems. I think politically, that's where he'd align himself. But again, I think the strength of the book lies in the fact that it moves us away from that cliche, not simply by saying, well, there's also, you know, it's also quite a diverse landscape, but also by getting us to think about what happens when you make yet more interventions in that landscape in the name of a kind of better aesthetic, quote unquote. You know, the idea of, if it's not going to be moche, it's going to be kind of, you know, attrayant, apaisant, whatever it might be. But it's a question of who makes that call on what's moche, actually. Again, that's not really a direct answer to your question, but it's really getting to, I think you're pointing to this ambivalence, this fundamental ambivalence, basically, that there is in terms of how you judge these spaces, on what grounds you judge these spaces, and what's at stake when, having made that judgment, you then intervene again. And I think that's one of the questions that Masspero raises when he goes to La Courneuve. He talks to people who, you know, that the housing block's been blown up, and they're going, yeah, it's great, but also my memories were there, you know, things like that. That wasn't really an answer to that. It was a good text, thanks for it.
Oui, français ou anglais?
Non, c'est pour vous aider.
D'accord. Alors, vous avez mentionné Michel Desserteau.
Oui.
Ça m'intéresse, j'aimerais vous entendre davantage là-dessus parce que Michel Desserteau, d'accord, d'entre nous doivent connaître le texte. Moi, j'ai eu à l'enseigner et tout, sauf que si j'avais à essayer de penser avec Michel Desserteau avec la question de la rue citoyenne à propos des espaces pavillonnaires, à propos des espaces de banlieue, par exemple, je ne saurais pas quoi faire. Il me semble que c'est davantage un modèle citoyen qui est basé sur la notion de quartier, ou enfin d'une espèce de proximité citoyenne qui est celle de la reconnaissance du point de vue de ces choses. Qu'est-ce qu'on peut faire avec la rue citoyenne de Michel Desserteau à propos des banlieues?
Très bonne question. Alors, tout d'abord, là, il faudrait un colloque là-dessus. D'abord, il faudrait peut-être penser à la façon dont il conçoit les espaces. J'ai relu le texte il n'y a pas trop longtemps, je suis toujours en train de relire, je ne l'avais pas lu depuis un certain moment, et ce qui m'a frappé, c'est la façon dont il parle des espaces technocratisés, enfin, tout ce qui est produit par la technocratie. Et donc on voit que ça sort d'un moment particulier de la France d'après-guerre, hein, tout le discours autour de l'aménagement. Et donc, la question est où se trouvent ces espaces technocratisés, planifiés. Et il y en a certainement au centre dans les centres-villes, au centre de Paris. Par exemple, on a le RER. Et il se trouve ailleurs aussi, en banlieue, dans les banlieues et dans tous les lieux d'habitation. Et je crois que c'est à partir de ce moment-là où on peut se tourner vers Michel de Certeau parce qu'il s'intéresse à des lieux d'habitation, des lieux de la vie quotidienne. Et donc, si on est en train de penser les pratiques de l'espace avec de Certeau, il faut qu'on pense à la façon dont on peut imaginer des ruses, des tactiques, des stratégies qui s'engagent, qui pratiquent ces espaces de la banlieue. Et, bon, alors pas dire d'autre. Vous me faites travailler. Comment? Ouais.
En fait, j'ai l'impression qu'il parle beaucoup, donc, de Certeau parle du quartier comme un lieu de reconnaissance où en fait on est identifié, en fait, donc si on compare ça à l'anonymat de la ville, dans le quartier, c'est un segment de la ville qui est à l'échelle humaine et on est reconnu et on sait qu'on est fils de tel ou tel. Et la banlieue, je crois que c'est vraiment un espace comme ça, donc en fait ce qui ressort des romans, c'est en fait qu'il y a un réseau très, très serré de reconnaissance et c'est un espace où on se connaît et en fait justement c'est l'anonymat de la ville qui fait défaut et en fait on voit dans certains romans qu'on essaie d'échapper à la banlieue parce que finalement c'est difficile de trouver l'anonymat qui permet des fois d'avoir un peu d'espace privé et qu'en fait c'est très souvent un espace collectif où en fait on évolue devant l'autre, sous le regard de l'autre, sous le regard de la bande ou de la bande des copains ou en fait qui a aussi en fait une sorte de réglementation de l'espace parce que on est tout le temps surveillé et on a peu de chances d'échapper à ça si on ne part pas. Donc je crois qu'il y a quand même un parallèle à ce propos. Peut-être ça ne s'applique pas vraiment de la vision de la banlieue dans les Passagers du Roissy-Express parce que finalement c'est un regard extérieur porté sur ces lieux qui ne sont pas un lieu de l'intérieur de façon intime de celui qui a toujours vécu dans ces lieux.
Oui, je suis d'accord en fait. Et là, ça revient à un aspect du travail de Certeau. La pensée de Certeau, c'est à la fois l'idée de communauté, donc l'identité définie par l'appartenance à un groupe, à une communauté. On est un peu trop vu, en quelque sorte, dans la banlieue. Mais c'est aussi une question de rapport avec l'espace et les espaces vécus. Et les deux, c'est intéressant de penser les deux ensemble, en fait. Comment le fait de vivre dans une espèce de communauté va avec une certaine pratique de l'espace. Et j'ai d'autres pistes, en fait, mais...
Je crois que de Certeau aussi a tendance à avoir l'espace, en fait, ces quartiers qu'il a en tête, c'est plus les quartiers ouvriers. Donc ce serait intéressant de penser à ce que la banlieue dont certains ont une tradition ouvrière et penser aux banlieues rouges, mais qui est en train de changer aussi. Donc est-ce que c'est une autre socialité quartier, est-ce que ça atteint cette notion de quartier? Est-ce que c'est une notion de quartier dans les banlieues qu'il y a d'ailleurs les quartiers ici, un mot en gros pour les quartiers?
Mais en fait, pour conclure là-dessus, en fait, le principe d'où commence de surtout, c'est l'idée qu'en fait, l'espace, les lieux ont été un peu volés des citoyens. Enfin, il y a une espèce de vol, c'est-à-dire que de réappropriation de l'espace par l'État. Et donc, tout le travail de vivre ou de réappropriation est une espèce est un travail de lutte contre le fait que les espèces ont été réappropriées par l'État. Et c'est là aussi qu'on peut trouver les pensées, les idées de surtout utiles lorsqu'on pense à la banlieue, surtout si on pense au grand ensemble, par exemple, où on a des espaces planifiés, des espaces contrôlés surveillés aussi. Et donc, on est dans un rapport assez compliqué en ce qui concerne la possession de l'espace, en quelque sorte.
I want to go back to how you started and your comment about the desire and the fascination for the banlieue, which I think is an important thing to be thinking about. And this notion of la vraie vie, right, authentic working class life. But it seems to me that I've always been very intrigued by the fascination and the desire for the violence also of the banlieue, and the way that is mythologized, and the way, the extent to which that also is often portrayed as la vraie vie, right? And I'm wondering if my spirit speaks about this a little bit, or something that you can mention.
Yeah, I think he does talk about that. Or he's travelling through 1989, so he's travelling through at a time when in a way it's kind of the end of the first wave of attempts to kind of resolve the problem of the banlieue, through kind of social action in particular. And he's also writing under a socialist government as well, of course, which perhaps raises its own kind of issues in terms of the politics of it all. It's kind of he's quite critical towards Castro actually in terms of the work of the Banlieue Catalan and of how he's not necessarily persuaded by the work that they're doing, but he's kind of drawing attention to the work that's being done on the ground, actually, the kind of bottom-up kind of work that's done by people on the ground. So I think he's not. I wouldn't say that Masvidal himself mythologizes or fantasizes the violence, actually, in the text, except that. Except in occasional, quite knowing ways in which he stages himself as having those reflex thoughts about the banlieue, which are embedded in the mediatization of them. So there are scenes where he says, he expresses the anxieties about being vulnerable to attack, about being mugged, and all these kinds of things, which he recognises as kind of mediated responses in a way. But I wouldn't say that he fetishizes the violence, but I would concur that the staging of the banlieue as a kind of a stage of violence is fundamental to the whole dynamic within the French media, and it would be fascinating to speculate as to what is going on there. Almost from a, dare I say, almost from a psychoanalytic perspective, in terms of, a certain kind of fulfillment of wishes on the part of, that's a very speculative line of inquiry. But yeah, I think there is this kind of peculiar desire for the banlieue, and you find it in the fascination for the banlieue in film, in particular, and there are certain ways in which, sometimes stylized portraits of banlieue violence are, I think, kind of problematic in a way. And also, in all those other kind of cultural forms. I'd quite like to, if I may, I'd quite like to kind of keep that notion of desire running through the conference and kind of see if we can get some answers in it at the end. Why do we desire the banlieue so much as a kind of, or why is it desired so much? What's the nature of that rather kind of almost erotic relationship with the banlieue, dare I say?
C'est aussi intéressant qui désire la banlieue, parce que on a réalisé avec les deux colloques, donc celui de l'an dernier et celui-ci, d'aborder dans le premier comment la banlieue est vue de l'extérieur et comment elle est montrée et médiatisée à travers les discours politiques et médiatiques. Et en fait, ce colloque fait un peu une réponse à ça, donc quelles sont les autres façons de voir et comment on peut la voir de l'intérieur et quels sont les discours que les habitants ou d'autres types de personnes avancent pour peut-être l'opposer aux clichés. Donc en fait, c'est intéressant de voir qui désire la banlieue, est-ce que la banlieue est désirée de l'extérieur ou de l'intérieur, quelle est la banlieue désirée, ou quelle est la banlieue que l'État désire, comment les banlieues désirées par l'État.
Voilà, quelle serait la banlieue idéale pour l'État, pour les gens qui habitent là, pour les Français.
Et c'est intéressant aussi de quelle banlieue on parle, parce que j'ai l'impression que la banlieue de Passagers, c'est peut-être plus la banlieue de 2014 non plus. Donc peut-être qu'il y a eu une évolution depuis, et peut-être que ce désir évolue aussi dans le temps. Donc c'est intéressant de voir comment.
Parce qu'en fait, la banlieue est désirée par beaucoup de gens, dans le sens où habiter en banlieue, c'est souvent désirable. C'est ce que disent beaucoup de gens dans le texte de Maspero. Ils aiment habiter là, en banlieue. Annie Renaud dit la même chose.
Et je crois que c'est confirmé aussi par les photos qu'on a prises, où en fait on a photographié pas mal de graffiti qui exprimaient justement le désir des habitants, ou en fait les mémoires des habitants, notamment de la commune, ceux qui ont été déroulés, qui ont laissé le message sur les murs, en disant que c'est un bon moment qu'ils sont passés là. Donc en parlant de désir, il y a le café qui est juste à temps, qui nous attend dans la salle à côté. Et en fait, on peut toujours poursuivre le débat autour du café et nous rentrer toujours pour parler de ces notions-là. Donc en fait, je vous invite à prendre un café dans la salle à côté. Et on devrait reprendre, je crois qu'on a une demi-heure, mais en fait, je vous invite à prendre les programmes étudiants de l'intérêt.